So the disastrous ground invasion of Gaza continues. Now, before we had, even before the ground invasion began, missiles fired at 4 boys who were killed on a beach. Clearly had nothing to do with Hamas. They were not hiding any weapons. They were killed right in front of all the reporters who reported it. And we've had, continuing according to the United Nations, about 70 to 80% civilians killed both before and after the ground invasion. We have well over 500 Palestinians who have been killed. We had a hospital that was shelled. These are all mistakes, of course. Everything is a mistake, and it's all because of Hamas's fault, because they would not accept a ceasefire. We'll come back to that idea in a second. So there were 2 reporters who were getting ready to do a shoot on the balcony of the 11th floor when there were shots fired right near them. They said, Stefanie Dekker, working for al-Jazeera, said 2 very precise shots were fired straight into our building. Now, that seems like an awfully large coincidence that they would be fired right near the balcony where they were going to shoot on the 11th floor. That seems kind of like perhaps warning shots. No one actually got shot, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it was warning shots. Here's an interesting point made by The Guardian. The incident came a day after Israel's foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, called for Al Jazeera to be banned. Interesting. He calls for them to get banned, and then all of a sudden there's shots fired into their building by the Israelis. Lieberman said the foreign ministry was taking steps to prevent it from broadcasting from Gaza. Could these be the steps? Or was it yet another unbelievable coincidence in all the things that Israel has done to avoid civilian casualties, but they just wind up shooting at hospitals and very dangerous journalists who don't cover the war in a way that they were told to cover the war, right? Now, Western media has played along brilliantly, but when Al Jazeera doesn't, they gotta go. And if they have to be, gone at the end of a rifle, well, it is what it is, right? So now, luckily, there has been a ceasefire proposed by, this time, Hamas. Okay, great. So let's see what Israel's reaction is. Justice Minister Tzipi Livni says, first of all, it won't happen before we really finish the tunnels project, which was laid out as a strategic objective. So in other words, no, we reject the ceasefire. We're going to continue bombing and doing the ground invasion until we get what we want. If it's not clear enough, she continues. Second, it won't happen in a way in which Hamas's completely unacceptable conditions are met, because it just won't. That is nearly identical language to what Hamas said. So Israel comes in here with their ally Egypt, who hates us, closed the border against us, and kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood, who was helping us. And then they say, oh, well, you want a ceasefire with all of your conditions and none of ours. Well, we reject that. That's exactly what Israel is saying now about the ceasefire offered by Hamas. She continues, she says, in a situation where Hamas says, give us everything or the fighting will continue, well then, the fighting will continue. Okay, so I guess now everything is Israel's fault. They rejected a ceasefire, because I was told for weeks now, since Gaza rejected a ceasefire, Hamas did, well, Israel had to continue the fighting and it was all Hamas's fault. Well, now Israel has rejected a ceasefire. You see how this is absurd? Both sides are fighting, okay? You can't just say one side is completely at fault because they rejected a ceasefire that was clearly one-sided. That applies to Israel and applies to Hamas as well. Okay, I'm sorry for being so even-handed. I know that's unacceptable. Okay, so now, you want to talk about unacceptable, we go to some of the right-wingers in Israel, and I'll get to the left-wingers as well. There's a guy named Mordecai Kedar of Bar-Ilan University. Now, this guy calls himself a professor. He says he worked, and he did, for 25 years in military intelligence. He's a researcher at the right-wing Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies of Bar-Ilan. He works with this organization called Israel Academia Monitor, where they monitor left-wing professors and try to get them thrown out of their universities. So this guy, who wants to make sure that left-wing professors don't say anything unacceptable, said this: the only thing that could deter a suicide bomber is knowing that if caught, his sister or his mother would be raped. But you see how the Palestinians are the bad guys, right? All right, let's continue more from this esteemed professor. It sounds very bad, but that's the Middle East. You have to understand the culture in which we live. The only thing that deters Hamas leaders is a threat to the connection between their heads and their shoulders. Now, who created this culture? Could it be so-called professors who say that innocent women should be raped because of their association with people? And by the way, their alleged association with some people. No, it's not the culture he created, even though he's the one saying it. It's all their fault. I had to rape his sister and his mother. He made me do it because of the culture he created. Well, isn't that convenient? He's not done. He says, I'm not talking about what we should or shouldn't do. I'm talking about the facts. The only thing that deters a suicide bomber is the knowledge that if he pulls the trigger or blows himself up, his sister will be raped. That's all. That's the only thing that will bring him back home in order to preserve his sister's honor. The right wing in Israel must be so proud. You see how barbaric the Palestinians are. We had to rape. You remember what Netanyahu said? We had to bomb the civilians. We had to bomb the hospital. We had to bomb the kids on the beach. Hamas made me do it. Now apparently Hamas, according to this right-wing professor, is saying that is going to make us rape their sisters and mothers. Now look, he's one guy. He doesn't represent all Israelis. There's some great Israelis that are standing up against this, including a series of former Israeli soldiers who say they refuse to be called up as reservists to fight in this war. They wrote a letter. It's an open petition. They say, we are more than 50 Israelis who were once soldiers and now declare our refusal to be part of the reserves. We oppose the Israeli army and the conscription law. Partly that's because we revile the current military operation. But most of the signers below are women and would not have fought in combat. For us, the army is flawed for reasons broader than the Operation Protective Edge or even the occupation. We rue the militarization of Israel and the army's discriminatory policies. So there are some strong voices speaking out against this war. In fact, there are stronger voices in Israel speaking out against it than there are here in the U.S. And yet the war machine purrs on. Now, why? I have to confess that I'm slightly embarrassed that I didn't figure this out earlier. Stephen M. Walt is a professor at Harvard. He's at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And he wrote a stinging piece against the Israel and the Israeli lobby and the right wing that pushes into war in the U.S. and in Israel. But he made a point that I wish I had figured out earlier, along with J.J. Goldberg. He says, according to J.J. Goldberg's report in the Jewish newspaper Forward, the Netanyahu government blamed Hamas for the kidnappings without evidence and pretended the kidnapped Israelis were still alive for several weeks, even though there was evidence indicating the victims were already dead. So now this is set up to, why did they go into Gaza in the first place? Why? Remember that Israel started bombing Hamas because of those 3 dead kids. Now, everybody's outraged by those 3 dead kids, as you should be, right? But apparently, according to J.J. Goldberg at the Forward, the Israeli government knew they were dead for some while, but kept up this anger in the streets about it anyway, pretending that they were alive. Now, again, that's his reporting, okay? They explained it perpetrated this deception in order to whip up anti-Arab sentiment and make it easier to justify punitive operations in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, here comes the really interesting part. And why did Netanyahu decide to go on another rampage in Gaza? As Nathan Thrall of the International Crisis Group points out, the real motive is neither vengeance nor a desire to protect Israel from Hamas's rocket fire, which has been virtually non-existent over the past 2 years, of course before the hostilities began recently, and is largely ineffectual anyway. Netanyahu's real purpose was to undermine the recent agreement between Hamas and Fatah for a unity government. Oh, of course, of course. See, that was a deal that happened recently. The Palestinians got united, and Israel hated that. Now, if you actually want a 2-state solution, that's actually very helpful. You'd be very happy about that, because finally they can come united to the negotiation table, and you can get to proceed with them in the peace talks and get the peace. It makes it easier, not harder. But if you don't want peace, and you don't want those talks to go on, well, you don't like the Palestinians being united. So you do everything you can to make sure that they are not united, that the West Bank is separate from the Gaza Strip, that the guys in Gaza are all the bad guys, and you can't work with them because they fire rockets, and they do X, Y, and Z. That's why you have to do a ground invasion, and make sure you split up the Palestinians. Given Netanyahu's, Professor Wall continues, given Netanyahu's personal commitment to keeping the West Bank and creating a greater Israel, the last thing he wants is a unified Palestinian leadership that might press him to get serious about a two-state solution. Ergo, he sought to isolate and severely damage Hamas and drive a new wedge between the two Palestinian factions. Now, do you have a sense of why these hostilities began in the first place? We've been telling you all along, this is the right wing in Israel, just as they do here and just as they do in places like Iran and many other countries. They drive us to more and more wars because they gain politically from those wars. They do not want peace. They do not want negotiations. They certainly don't want the people that they're supposed to be negotiating with unified. They want them separated, in shambles, and to have no leverage at all. This is all so Netanyahu can continue to stay in power. And it is grotesque.